Welcome everybody to this evening's public lecture, which by now I think many of you will know is part of the Leverhulme Trust Conspiracy and Democracy project, which is a multi-year venture designed to think about the relationship between conspiracies, conspiracy theories, and democracy. And the project does that from a variety of different disciplinary angles, including history, political theory, and internet studies. And tonight we're really lucky to welcome Dr. Reza Zia-Ebrahimi, who's joining us from King's College London, where he's a senior lecturer in history. Reza completed his DPhil at Oxford, at St Antony's College, where he focused on Iran and Iranian history. And in 2016, he published The Emergence of Iranian Nationalism in Iran, Race and the Politics of Dislocation, with Columbia University Press. So tonight, Reza is talking to us about antisemitism and Islamophobia, with his talk, which is entitled When the Elders of Zion Relocated to Eurabia. So following the talk, there'll be a response from Dr. Hugo Leal, and then we'll open up to questions and answers, after which there'll be a wide reception outside. So I'll hand over to Reza now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to my old friend Tanya Filer for inviting me here tonight. And thank you to Alex Colassa, who put up with my many bizarre requests over the past few months and made this event possible. And thank you all for attending this talk. My talk is going to focus mostly on an article which is forthcoming and is going to be published under the same title as the talk in the journal Patterns of Prejudice, sometimes probably before the end of the year, which itself is part of a larger project looking at anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and which hopefully will lead to the publication in a few years of a monograph and a documentary film, if I get the funding. So that's for the background. Now, the conceptual background of my research is essentially centered on the realization fairly recently that anti-Semitism and Islamophobia might have an entangled history or display discursive affinities. It's a fairly recent realization. It's only in 1985 that Edward Said said in passing that anti-Semitism and Orientalism are secret sharers, strange secret sharers. But he left it at that and never really pursued his intuition. And it's really in the past couple of years that a number of authors have started to pick up the torch where he left it and look at this topic more closely. Gil Anajar, who published the book Semites in 2008, you could claim that this is the first and so far only monograph that looks at anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in parallel, although the subject is slightly different. It's the idea of the Semitic race. And very recently, literally a couple of months ago, this edited volume came out, a volume that has been edited by Ben Gidley and John Renton. Apart from that, several authors, mostly sociologists but also historians, have made this point, mostly in article form. So it's really a field that is nascent, and most of the research currently is only in article form. But it raises several very important conceptual questions, namely, if we can claim that there is an entangled history between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, what exactly is the nature of that entanglement? In other terms, what typological category can we place them in? Arguably, it has to be the same category to make the comparison possible. The argument that has been made so far is that both are to be taken as cases of racism, simply. And it will come across as a very obvious thing to say, as opposed to most people. But the reality is that anti-Semitism has traditionally been studied outside of race and racism studies. We're talking about two different academic camps, as it were. A colleague of mine calls that methodological separatism. So to really generalize and simplify the two camps. So you could say on the one hand, you have authors that work on anti-Semitism. They have been very influenced by Hannah Arendt's work. They are very much concerned with totalitarianism, and they see the totalitarian state as paving the way for the Holocaust. And the Holocaust is really their main focus when it comes to the study of racism. On the other hand, you have people that have been influenced by Frantz Fanon or Stuart Hall in this country, whose main concern has been imperialism and colonial forms of racism, and including post-colonial forms of racism, which can include Islamophobia. And they have a tendency to consider anti-Semitism as a thing of the past. Even one section, you could claim, sees Zionism as a form of racism, etc. So we clearly have here two camps that consider each other as rivals, if you will, rather than potential collaborators in a larger project to look at racism from a more holistic manner. There is, within academia, but particularly outside of academia in the world of polemicists and essayists, tremendous ideological resistance to any comparison between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. It's a long story. I'm not going to bore you with it here and now. Happy to talk about it during the Q&A. But I think the theory of new anti-Semitism casts a long shadow over these discussions, and of course so does the Israel-Palestine conflict. Now, the two camps that I just described are far from being neat, of course. I don't want to claim that these are ideal types. After all, Hannah Arendt herself claimed in the second volume of Totalitarianism that racism is a necessary ingredient of European colonialism, that both played an important role in bringing about the totalitarian state, etc. Nevertheless, it has been argued by the people I just mentioned that these divisions and fault lines must be transcended now. If we could consider anti-Semitism and Islamophobia as cases of racism, the advantage here would be that we could then apply the findings of race studies since the 1960s to shed a new light on both, which is not something to be neglected. It can open up, huge new areas of studies. However, in order to show that we're talking about two cases of racism, we have to show that Jews and Muslims have been racialized. How can we talk of racism if there is no race? So at the moment, in the very young field of Islamophobia studies, this is the core question. This is what most of the field is preoccupied with, modalities of racialization. Brian Klug recently wrote a very interesting article on that, a sort of like compte rendu of the field at the moment. What exactly is racialization? So racialization is also referred to as race formation. It is the operation of making a group into a race. In other terms, the operation of ascribing inherent characteristics to a group of people. Characteristics that then are assumed to be shared by all the individuals, more or less, within that group. If you look at the more traditional strands in racism studies, Michael Banton, for instance, racialization is traditionally assumed to be a phenotypical phenomenon or biological. In other terms, the races themselves are assumed to be biological biologically defined, or at least phenotypically defined. Phenotypically defined means, in terms of morphology. So, blacks and whites are different colors, so there are two different races. But here, we are talking about groups that are primarily religious groups. So, obviously, in Europe, in the heydays of anti-Semitism, Jews were not physically distinguishable from Gentiles. Even in Nazi Germany, where there were strong ideas of a Jewish race, the Nazis never came up with a physical indicator of Jewishness. And in order to identify Jews, they had to rely on hearsay, for instance. And according to Francisco Betancourt, used the same techniques as the Inquisition would use in pre-modern times. And likewise, Muslims can have any phenotypical characteristics, right? Given that Islam is a universal, global religion with followers practically everywhere. Therefore, the racialization that we are talking about is primarily cultural and religious. And there is a great deal of overlap between the two. And this is only fair because biology is far from being the only marker of race in traditional forms of racism. In fact, it's a very marginal form of racism. So coming back to anti-Semitism and Nazi anti-Semitism, again, although there was a very strong idea of a Jewish race, still the idea of the Jew in Nazi authors still harks back to sort of like pre-modern cultural ideas of what a Jew is and how a Jew presumably behaves. Now, in this context, I personally find the work of Gil Anejar interesting because he studies this process of cultural racialization through the writings of 19th century philologists. Ernest Renan and others. The idea of the Semitic race, i.e. Jews and Arabs conflated into a race, by extension Muslims as well, I'll come back to it, is an idea that emerges in the 19th century and is predicated on the assumption that the Semitic languages have brought about a distinct race. So it is really religion and language here that are the markers of race. If you read Ernest Renan or other Semitic philologists, comparative philologists in the 19th century, they clearly say that there is such a thing as the Semitic mind, and the Semitic mind is shaped by either the Hebrew language or the Arabic language and expresses itself in the holy scriptures of the two monotheistic languages, religions. My argument in all of this is that this is great. I mean, we've come a long way, and it is very important to recognize that cultural racialization is the most common form of racialization, especially today. However, there is one mechanism of racialization that has so far been neglected, and that's conspiracy thinking. Which conspiracy theories are we talking about? Well, we're talking about anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, world Jewish conspiracies, and so on and so forth. And their Islamophobic equivalent, which are mainly today theories of Islamization, of the Islamization of Europe, particularly. I call this conspiratorial racialization. And in fact, I argue that these conspiracy theories are, you could claim, the high point of racialization. It's the ultimate stage of racial demonization. Not only is there a group that has been otherized, not only have immutable characteristics been attributed to that group, but that group is now also represented as bent on our destruction, because that's what these conspiracy theories are about. The destruction of the Western civilization by Jews and by Muslims. Jews through their domination of finance and the media, supposedly, and government, and Muslims through demographic transformation of European societies. And in order to make my point, perhaps the first step towards making my point, I have carried out a intertextual comparison between the archetypical world Jewish conspiracy theory, as it is expressed in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was published in 1903, and Eurabia, the Euro-Arab axis, which is possibly the most influential theory of the Islamization of Eurabia, the Islamization of Europe, which was published in 2005, so about 100 years apart from each other, which could make the comparison problematic. I do claim that there are many differences in format and authorial intention in the two texts, but there are very striking similarities in their discursive dynamics and particularly the strategies of racialization of Jews and Muslims. So the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, I assume that everybody has heard about them or has some idea of what they are. So this is a notorious forgery which first appears in Russian in 1903, although we do know that the original text was written in French. And as I said, it's the quintessential world Jewish conspiracy theory, which played a role of great incidence in bringing about the Holocaust. It was famously on Hitler's night table. And it's a conspiracy theory that struck a very deep chord in a world that was beset by transformations that were very difficult to comprehend for most people. And that a conspiracy theory could make sense of. I guess that's the primary use of a conspiracy theory. So it captured the imagination of a very large European anti-Semitic public by leading them to believe that the French Revolution and the 1848 revolutions and the loss of power of the church and the dislocations caused by industry all can be attributed to a secret Jewish conspiracy. In terms of the narrative of the text itself, it claims to be the minutes of a secret meeting of Jewish leaders in the eerie atmosphere of the Prague Jewish cemetery, where the leaders meet once a century to update each other on their efforts to take over the world, as it were. And so what is this plan exactly? Well, it involves the infiltration of practically all Gentile institutions, governments, political parties, armies, banks, universities, schools, and so on and so forth. And this is all made possible thanks to two tools that the Jews are assumed to possess: gold, or an unlimited amount of it, and control over the media. Distant echoes of these theories today. So I hope to be forgiven for not spending too much time on the protocols, because there's already significant literature on it. I'm going to spend most of my time talking about Eurabia, which is very understudied. But just to say, just to give you an idea of the style of the protocols, I'm going to quote one of the a passage from it that sort of summarizes the Elders of Zion's plan for the world. So it says, "And the weapons in our hands are limitless ambitions, burning greediness, merciless vengeance, hatreds and malice. It is from us that the all-engulfing terror proceeds. We have in our service persons of all opinions, of all doctrines, monarchists, demagogues, socialists, communists, and utopian dreamers of every kind that are assumed to help the conspiracy. We have harnessed them all to the task." And it's on these words that the text comes to an end. Now Eurabia. Eurabia was written by Battier, whose real name is Giselle Littmann. Battier is her pen name. It's Hebrew for daughter of the Nile, in reference to the fact that she was born in Egypt to European Jewish parents. And they were part of the communities that were expelled from Nasserist Egypt in 1957, following the Suez Crisis. After which she married a chap who has some fame of his own called David Littman, and they moved to Lausanne in Switzerland, which is in fact where I grew up. So I tried to play on this theme of neighborhood to get her to talk to me, but so far without success. She came to relative fame in the 1880s and 90s with her theory of dimitude, which you might have. Sorry? 1980s and 1990s with her theory of dimitude, which is a theory, I think it's slightly off topic. I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A. But it's a theory that is very common among self-styled counter-jihadi authors and so on and so forth. She was very close, of the ideological perspective, that she was extremely close to some Lebanese Christian militias during the Lebanese Civil War, very close to specific groups in the Israeli far right, and also Serbian ultranationalists during the war in the Balkans. So Eurabia was published in 2005. What is Eurabia about? It is about a almost diabolical Islamic civilization that is scheming to destroy Europe as we know it, and create in its stead a new geopolitical unit called Eurabia, and which encompasses the entire Mediterranean, as you can see on the book cover. And in Eurabia, Sharia law and jihad reign supreme, and Jews and Christians live as second-class citizens. And so Batior's claim is to have uncovered this conspiracy and now communicating it to the public. Interestingly, Batior goes to lengths to actually define Islam and its essence, which in itself is a process of racialization, something that you don't find in the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And this Islamic essence, she simply calls it jihad. All right? So she blurs the lines, in fact, by deploying a frightening term and associating its negative charge with all things and people Islamic. It's really a timeless essence that encompasses a few fundamental Islamic characteristics, or what she assumes to be fundamental Islamic characteristics. What are they? Belligerency, an irrepressible urge to subjugate Christians and Jews, honor killings, genital mutilation, stoning, and so on and so forth. So for her, this Islamic jihadi essence defines Islam everywhere and in all historical periods. So it's effectively been controlling the minds of all Muslims since the 7th century to this day. So in Batior, there is no such thing as space or time when she discusses Islam. There is no contingency. It's atemporal, it's immutable. For instance, she makes the point that a terrorist's call today to kill infidels is not circumstantial. It's the inherent nature of Islam as it has manifested itself ever since the religion has come into being. Now let's look at the actual conspiracy in Eurabia. So it's quite interesting because all the conspiracy theories, if you read Abbé Baruel or Henri Gougenot and many other conspiracy theories that appeared in the 19th century and featured the Illuminati, the Freemasons, or indeed the Elders of Zion, were secret societies plotting in a subterranean world of machination and deception. Eurabia is different. In Eurabia, there is an institution that essentially has instigated the Eurabian conspiracy. It's the Euro-Arab Dialogue, or EAD, which in fact really exists, or has really existed. It was founded in 1973 after the oil crisis, and its membership was composed of the Arab League states and what used to be the European Community member states in the 70s. According to Batior, this organization is plotting the gradual effacement of European nation states and the creation of Eurabia. It is, quote, a formidable political and legal superstructures that controls Europe. End of quotation. So it's sort of like an almighty, diabolical organization that essentially writes our school curricula, influences our thoughts, controls our immigration policies, and writes our future. Nothing less than that. The reality of the EAD is, of course, very, very different. The objective of this organization was never really clear beyond some vague talk of cooperation between the Arab world and Europe. It had no decision-making powers, and it did not achieve anything of note. And it, in fact, died a slow death. It ceased to exist, effectively, in 1979, something that Batior hides from her reader to maintain the illusion that the EAD is still controlling our lives. And in fact, Eurabia is the title of the organization's publication that used to be published in the 70s, I think 5 issues. So anyway. Another flaw is the exact role of the Arab League states in propagating jihad and Sharia. In the 70s, many of these states were nationalists or socialists, and why would Hafez al-Assad, who killed 20,000 people in his campaign against the Muslim Brotherhood in 1982, support jihad and Islamization? The same goes for Gaddafi, who throughout the 42 years of his rule threw Islamists and jihadists in jail and executed them in droves. But this logical flaw in Batior's writing can be explained with reference to that definition of that Islamic jihadi essence that I talked earlier. For her, Muslims everywhere can only serve the cause of jihad. Okay? It is in their essence, it is in their nature, and they cannot go against their nature. So I'm not going to describe in too much detail the methods of the EAD to bring about Eurabia, because we have little time, but essentially it's partly cultural and partly demographic. Most Islamization theories have a demographic element in them. The European and the Arab governments that are represented in the EAD are essentially conniving to open the gates to a sustained flow of Muslim immigrants into Europe. And according to all these theories, including Eurabia, Muslims have a far higher reproduction rate. And as the late, great Italian journalist Oriana Fallaci once said, they, quote, multiply like rats, end of quote. So there is going to be a cultural demographic takeover, and the Muslims are going to be a majority in Europe in, depending on the theories, 10 years, 20 years, one generation. Robert Spencer has been saying for 15 years that it's going to happen in 10 years. So it's a very familiar trope. Just listen to Geert Wilders, who's now the second most popular politician in the Netherlands. He's a major propagator of the theory of Islamization, very much inspired by Eurabia. He actually mentions the name of Eurabia in his political speeches. And it's a theory that goes, to some extent unchallenged. There have been very few works trying to debunk the myth of Islamization. There is this Canadian journalist called Doc Saunders, who published a book a couple of years ago called The Myth of the Muslim Tide. And there is a French scholar, a very serious scholar, called Raphaël Liogier, who published a book called The Myth of Islamization about 2-3 years ago. And that's about it. That the space is generally occupied by people that propagate the myth rather than question its fundamentals. So the Eurabia as a theory of a Sharia state assumes, again, and this goes back to that jihadi essence, that all Muslims, A, agree on what Sharia is, which, as I'm sure you know, it's far from being the case. B, that there is no opposition or different views among them. That C, they all want to apply it to their private lives. And D, that they also want to impose it on others. Now, the question arises, in the context of the EAD, why would European states contribute to the Eurabian project? Is it not a case of collective suicide? What's the interest? What is it in there for them? So there are several reasons, according to Battieur. The first is the money, stupid. Battieur assumes that Arab states sit on an unlimited amount of petrodollars. There's some distant echo of the unlimited financial means of the Jews in the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And so in her view, the Arab states have effectively bought off the European institutions to serve the Eurabian project. I mean, all of this, of course, runs in the face of most of the literature that I think there is almost a full consensus in Middle Eastern studies that the oil weapon, the use of the oil weapon has always been a failure. It's never been effective. Another reason for the involvement of European states or European institutions is appeasement. Battieur considers that Europe is in, quote, collusion with international terrorism, end of quotation, because some European countries refuse to get involved with the war on terror. So Europe somehow supports terrorism by opposing the war on terror and some of Israel's policies. The third reason is the third reason that she comes up with is political, and it's in fact a case of a minor case or major case of historical revisionism. She claims that the European project, European Union, European Community before it, from the beginning was a plan to link Europe to the Arab world to oppose the United States, which is a force for good. It's a rather novel reading of European history. I thought that the European project came about against Nazism to avoid war and with significant American support. But obviously, I'm under the influence of Islamic propaganda. So overall, Battieur's story of the power of the EAD is in fact a complete inversion of the Euro-Arab or Euro-Mediterranean relationship. The Barcelona process, the European neighborhood policy, the Union for the Mediterranean, in all these frameworks that have tried to bring together the two shores of the Mediterranean, the European Party has always dictated its terms to the Arabs and not the other way around. And there's a huge literature on this. But for Battieur, it is the other way around. And I think in conspiracy theories, facts are besides the point. Now, the comparison between the two texts. At first glance, the protocols and Eurabia are two very different types of texts. The protocols are a forgery. We know since 1921 that it mostly paraphrases an older text published in 1864 by a chap called Maurice Joly called Dialogue in Hell between Machiavelli and Montesquieu. It paraphrases, it's a patchwork of different citations. Eurabia, on the other hand, is an authentic text. It even parades as an academic one, complete with an elaborate apparatus of annotations and footnotes and a very long bibliography. It actually sometimes reads like a tedious study in international law because she describes these conferences of the EAD or Barcelona process, etc., and goes into detail about them. So constant references to obscure international organizations with their acronyms and their reports and the arcane resolutions that came out of their meetings. So this all gives Eurabia a veneer of scientific validity. But what is important is that unlike the meeting of the Elders of Zion in the Prague Jewish Cemetery, all these conferences really took place. Fantasy starts only with the interpretation of the outcome of these conferences, which then become part of a master plan to force the Sharia law down your throats and annihilate Western civilization and so on and so forth. The meetings did take place, but they are assumed to hold magical powers almost. So slightly different formats between the two texts. And I also venture to claim that there is most probably a major difference in authorial intention, as the protocols were almost certainly written by a professional forger who was tasked with the writing of the protocols. So there are various theories. Was it the Russian secret services? There's literature now that says that was perhaps not the case. There's a very interesting novel by Umberto Eco called The Prague Cemetery, which significantly uses historical primary sources. And the main protagonist is the chap who wrote the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So it's Umberto Eco's, if you will, like version of the origins of the text. But in the case of Eurabia, there is no reason to believe that Batior does not believe in her own conspiracy theory. So authorial intention is radically different here. However, there are three functional similarities between the two texts. One is what I have so far referred to as conspiratorial racialization. In my view, in presenting Jews and Muslims as a monolithic pack, as it were, instinctively acting in unison towards a conspiracy, both texts racialize them. The protocols and Eurabia define Jews and Muslims as races with fixed behavioral and moral characteristics that are not contingent on individuality or even time and space. And these fixed characteristics enable them to relentlessly pursue one sole and ultimate objective, which is our destruction. So they are agents of a conspiracy because of their inherent nature, which is immutable. The marker of race here is the conspiracy itself. And Jews and Muslims conspire against Western civilization almost unconsciously. I am reminded of this quotation from Hitler that's reported in the Goebbels diaries, where he says, quote, "In all the world, Jews are alike, whether they live in a ghetto of the East or in the bankers' palaces of the city of Wall Street, they will always pursue the same aims and without previous agreement, even use the same methods." They might not know it themselves. Unconsciously, they are helping towards the conspiracy, the takeover. Batior's Muslims also unconsciously wage jihad. Even nationalist and socialist leaders who actually executed jihadists, such as Gaddafi, they were still waging jihad, perhaps without knowing, because it's their nature, it's their instincts. The second similarity is what I call supernatural reimagination. So what does that mean? The two target populations in the two texts, in their own historical contexts, were and are among the most arguably vulnerable groups in society. In the interwar period, Jews had not been emancipated yet in Russia, which is where a vast majority of them lived, European Jews. And in the West, there were significant obstacles to social ascension. And when there was genuine social ascension, it was often perceived as a threat by some Gentiles. The Dreyfus affair is one case. Yet they were perceived as, in the conspiratorial anti-Semitic imagination, as almighty, almost comfortably in control of the world's finance and the media. Similarly today, I think that it is fair to claim that Muslims are not, in most European countries, faring too well, in the sense that in most cases, they find themselves in the lower strata of the social pyramid, both in terms of income and education, and also influence. Nobody represents them because, as Olivier Roy argues, there is no such thing as a Muslim community. The Muslims are not organized as a community and do not seem to be interested in organizing themselves as a community. Moreover, they are on a daily basis demonized by hugely popular political parties, suspected of harboring jihadist sympathies, and there are institutionalized discriminatory measures in place against them that have been studied and quantified in the dispensation of public housing or jobs, etc. Very few European politicians or millionaires are Muslim. No party wins elections if they are perceived as being soft on Muslims or being close to Muslims or friendly to Muslims. Yet, according to Batior, Muslims, quote, influence strongly both religious and political developments in Europe without any hindrance from their mosques and cultural centers, end of quote. In the conspiratorial Islamophobic imagination, Muslims are reimagined as almighty again, almost having magical powers. They can easily take over Europe in a blink of the eye, behind your back, thanks to their presumed unity of purpose, their unlimited supply of money, their complete control over European institutions, their women's prolific wombs, and their men's almost invincible violence. But there is something else than that, something else that helps them, and that's the third similarity between the two conspiracy theories, the European fifth column. And I think that's very striking similarities. Both Jews and Muslims in the two conspiracy theories benefit from the help of a fifth column from among the Europeans. In the case of the protocols, these are the socialists and anarchists and communists and so on, as mentioned in that quotation earlier, who serve as the modern day, as they would say in French, Judenknecht, the servant of the Jews, which is a medieval concept, but it was also used under the Nazis to refer to anyone who opposed Nazi policies. So see, the internationalism of the socialists seems to predispose them to support the similarly stateless Jews who are presumed to lack loyalty to European nations. And similarly, in the case of Eurabia, the European institutions that are supranational in character serve as the servants of the Muslims, Muslimenknecht, if you will. So there are two similarities here. One is that the Jews and the Muslims' supposed lack of loyalty to the state on grounds of primary religious or supranational loyalties, and their ability to list the collaboration of Gentiles or non-Muslims who equally lack loyalty to nation states, allow them to bring about their conspiracies. In the old days, the fifth column was the socialists, and today's the European institutions, but also still a little bit the left. The left today in Islamophobic texts is, and particularly in this one, is assumed to be in bed with Islam. And it is this left that Anders Behring Breivik targeted when he cold-bloodedly assassinated 69 members of the Norwegian Labour Party's youth movement on the island of Utøya. This is the left that opens the gates to the Muslims. Now, so it could be argued that Eurabia matters little, especially in comparison with the protocols, of course. However, I would like to argue that Eurabia matters far more than it first appears. We should not write it off as the work of some lunatic. It is the work of some lunatic, but it is an influential work of a lunatic. There is not a single populist or far-right party in Europe today, according to my research, that does not uphold some variation of the myth of the Islamization. So Geert Wilders is perhaps the best known and the most popular, but Marine Le Pen as well once tweeted, quote, "If we lose the elections, The veil will be imposed on all women, and Sharia law will replace our constitution, and barbarity will take our place. End of quote. 15,000 likes. There is also a coterie, of course, of self-styled jihadi, counter-jihadi authors. In the States, there's Robert Spencer, who's famous. Over here, I think Melanie Phillips is the most famous of them. There's also Mark Steyn, who's sort of like in between, in the middle of the Atlantic, is both active here and over there. But more disturbingly, Batior has benefited from academic support and endorsements, including by these three fairly prominent and famous historians. Sir Martin Gilbert of Oxford. Neil Ferguson does not need to be introduced, I suppose, and Robert Wistrich. Neil Ferguson has endorsed the book on his back. I don't have it here, but he essentially calls it prophetic and so on and so forth. And he has penned a few op-eds playing on the theme of Islamization and Eurabia. These people have played a role of great importance in promoting Batior as a scholar of Islam, although she has no university degree and has never been, peer-reviewed, and is ridiculed by most of the profession, or used as a primary source. Eurabia is not published. The English version is not published by some obscure right-wing outlet. It's published by Fairleigh Dickinson University Press, which is Fairleigh Dickinson University is a university in New Jersey. In 2006, Robert Wistrich, who is a prominent scholar of anti-Semitism, invited Batior to give a talk at the Vidal Sassoon International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And the irony of the location and the host and the guest is just flabbergasting, at least to me. She has also given talks at Tel Aviv University, and perhaps less surprisingly, she has given briefings on Capitol Hill about Islam 3 times. But that's less surprising, right? All sorts of silly people give hearings on Islam on Capitol Hill. But finally, I think the list of her admirers would not be complete if I did not mention again Breivik, the mass murderer of Utøya. He killed 77 people on that July day of 2011 to stop the Islamization of Norway. In the manifesto that he left behind, which is called 2083, A Declaration of European Independence, pretty tedious, he distributed it online before committing his abomination. The words Eurabia and Eurabian appear 159 times, and Batior is mentioned 62 times with great difference. Also mentions Ferguson once. This is also why Eurabia matters. The Islamization conspiracy theory dehumanizes Muslims to such an extent that murderous acts become possible. So to wrap up, I would simply say that now from the broader perspective, there is a lot to be learned from the comparative or diachronic or entangled analysis of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And we must be able now in the 21st century to transcend some of the academic divisions and fault lines that have so far inhibited a more holistic study of racism. And finally, conspiracy theories. So these are just 2 examples. I mean, there's many more conspiracy theories, and my book is looking at a far broader range of them from the 1850s to today. But conspiracy theories are a very promising area of research in the examination of the modalities of non-biological racialization in both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and possibly in other forms of racism as well. Thank you very much. So, thank you. Shall I take questions? Oh, Hugh, sorry, yeah. Here you go.
Okay, I'm afraid that my response paper might be longer than the article itself, so I'll try to stick to the script. So I'm a researcher here at CRASSH, working on the network effects of ideas such as conspiracy theories and the people who spread them, and the link between these and political mobilization, and finally the transformation of the media sphere. So there is the fortunate coincidence that when it comes to specific topics, we have overlapping but complementary research interests. I'm currently working on the Islamization conspiracy theory, trying to identify its political directions and trace how this particular conspiratorial belief spreads. So I pick up the storyline more or less where Reza leaves it, and unsurprisingly, I find your paper both historically significant and very timely. And I think you wrote one of the most compelling accounts to date on the similarities between the historical process of racialization of Jews and Muslims, antisemitism as a blueprint for Islamophobia, and with the conceptual innovation of adding conspiratorial modes of thinking as a fundamental element to this creation of the real other as the imagined enemy. And as Professor Evans would ask, where is the conspiracy? And Reza just explained this. The Muslims have a plan for the creation of Eurabia, but as far as conspiracies go, that alone wouldn't fly. So it's on the European side that the treacherous co-conspirators lie. The willing subjects of Eurabia occupy the higher echelons of power and give wings to the narrative. And the conspiracy theory text, Eurabia, I think is both very clear in its identification of the plotters and obscure when it comes to revealing the inner workings of the plot. So who are the conspirators and why? In these kind of intricate and convoluted narratives, usually there are several plot devices, logical or illogical leaps of faith. In this case, the leap of faith resembles the deus ex machina of the Greek tragedy, an agent who appears unexpectedly to solve the insoluble problem of who and why. And I would call it the disconcerted author of Eurabia claims that it is all about the demographic and cultural concert of Muslim immigrants and Euro-Arab elites. And Reza explained how the role played by the EAD. So how does a zombie organization undermine the European project and union and set in motion what the Front National calls the grand remplacement, the demographic transformation of the European continent? This is a cliffhanger that she does not explain, a mystery that maybe the author is saving for the sequel, Eurabia 2, The Muslim Menace. So, much to his credit and patience, Reza goes to great lengths to meticulously address the main tenets of the conspiracy theory, debunking them one by one. However, if there is something we agree on in this project, is that these theories are not falsifiable, verifiable for the believers. And if reality doesn't fit the narrative, then they change reality. For the narrative is immutable and irrefutable. So one wonders who the addressees of your article are, and I will return to this topic later. First, I'll briefly gloss over the historical dimension of Reza's article and the reimagination of Jews as the internal enemy and Muslims as the external threat in the two texts, the Protocols and Eurabia. First, the depiction of Jews and Muslims, the image that comes to mind when we think of them. Reza quotes Brian Klug on the Muslim figure, and this bears indeed a resemblance with the historical representation of the Jew as the tiny, greedy schemer with a disproportionate nose and matching power, a caricature perceived as reality with dramatic consequences. And once again, the conspiratorial dimension is present. And I think there is a very interesting semiotics research paper up for grabs. The current depiction of Muslims, both narrative and pictorial, as compared to the traditional depiction of Jews. Second, the historical resonance of the protocols in the Eurabia can shed some light on the reality versus fiction binaries, which, with corresponding confusion and even fusion of true and false, of opinions and facts. The protocols are real fiction, whereas Eurabia is fictionalized reality. In this sense, one of the questions I'd like to ask is if Reza has looked into the utilization of the so-called Pact of Umar by pushers of the Islamization conspiracy theory. This covenant, whose authenticity as such is refuted by many scholars of Islam and Islamic scholars, and whose content is unknown to the common Muslim believer, is also presented by the Islamophobes as the future constitution of Eurabia, a pact of submission and humiliation. Now, how an apocryphal document unknown to conspirators and co-conspirators alike could be the roadmap for the recolonization of the continent is obviously another illogical leap of faith. So, given the questions surrounding the historical authenticity of the document and the allegations that the attribution to Umar, the second Khalifa, are probably a forgery, I wonder if a comparison between the protocols and the pact wouldn't be more suitable in this case, in the sense that Eurabia, the book, appears as a mere academic vulgate, whereas the Pact of Umar is presented by the likes of Spencer, Geller, and other Islamophobes as historical proof of the Muslim plans for the submission of the Al-Udhima. Now, and this leads me to another Islamophobic appropriation, which is the very concept of Al-Udhima. That literally actually means protected people. But to Battior and others, it became the conquered infidels. And so the manipulation of a language that most of them do not speak is also an important aspect of this conspiracy. Third, who are these stealth jihadis in the Islamophobe imagery and imagination? According to Reza, on top of a racial conception of the other, there is a conspiratorial misconception of their actions and aims. I think the great contribute of this article is indeed the identification of conspiratorial thinking as a constitutive element of this construction, deconstruction of even destruction of the idea of Jews and Muslims. And Reza qualifies this as this dynamic as conspiratorial racialization, as you just heard, the essentialization of a large and arguably diverse population into a monolithic group animated by one will. In this sense, again, one wonders if the following logic is correct. Not all conspiracy theorists are racists, but racists tend to be conspiracy theorists. Also, it would be interesting to understand if, from the author's perspective, conspiracies are a marker of all processes of racialization, and how the conspiratorial racialization of Jews and Muslims fares against that of other stigmatized groups singled out by certain cultural or religious traits, or biological even, such as blacks or the Romani. Additionally, I ask myself and the author if this concept travels beyond the groups and areas identified in the article, Jews and Muslims in the West. For example, what is the intellectual, let's call it that, foundation for the current wave of Islamophobia in India or Myanmar? Can we identify a dynamic of conspiratorial racialization there? Also, it would be interesting to explore the racialization of the other in Muslim-majority societies and the hypothetical manifestation of conspiratorial beliefs. For example, Copts in Egypt, where I lived for a while, are many times portrayed as the enemy within, and Yazidis in the Middle East have been persecuted for centuries, many times on the basis of symbology. And finally, I'd like to hear from Reza, a bit of polemic, on this historical and abhorrent irony of having the state of Israel, through its legitimate government, as one of the active promoters of a conspiracy theory, the Islamization of Europe, which follows the same blueprint that brought destruction upon Europe and death to millions of Jews in this country. So this conspiracy theory is not only about inside-out dynamics, it reveals a distorted social dynamics perspective through which the inferior other, the enemy within, is simultaneously the almighty other that will annihilate our superior, culture. And this invokes two questions of power and agency. The enemy within, Muslim, is also the neighbor without, destitute immigrant, the refugee. And the neighbor without, perceived as a social unit, an automaton with no free will, is at the same time the agent of our collective doom. The destitute becomes the overlord, the brainless automaton becomes the master conspirator, weaving the web which will ultimately entrap the Western civilization. So indecipherable contradictions are indeed the currency of conspiratorial beliefs, and in this context, I argue, critical culture becomes an invaluable tool and moral obligation of academics, journalists, and public. And this brings us to the present relevance of Reza's work, and to the point where our research meets, actually. Islamophobia and conspiratorial beliefs about Muslims are at the center of the current wave of populist and nativist politics. See Agent Orange in the White House, the regressive National Front in France, or the new German alternative with undertones of the old German solutions. Islamophobia also inspired, as you just said, extremist acts of violence like the massacre of Utøya in Norway, carried out by a conspiracy believer. He used other scholarly Islamophobes, not just the ones you mentioned, but also my background is Middle East studies as well. Daniel Pipes, Bernard Lewis, and then indeed the organic intellectuals of the American far right's reemergence, such as Spencer, Gettler, and Battier. Maybe the end of 77 mostly white and secular lives at the hands of one of their ilk should give them some pause to avoid pain. Reza alludes to the current impact of these marginal ideas turned into mainstream narrative. He calls it the legitimization of Islamophobia. Islamophobic thinking today, he writes, is as legitimate as antisemitism was when the protocols were published. And this is indeed spot on. In the last weeks, I've been using my preliminary research on this topic for outreach activities, trying to both explain and understand why the Islamization conspiracy theory is not a marginal belief anymore, but a mainstream narrative. For example, I've been talking about this perception gap, the difference between the real and perceived percentage of Muslims living in the West is widening, and worryingly so. We see Muslims, the other, the enemy, everywhere. Or the finding of our own survey in the project that shows a widespread belief that governments are intentionally lying about the number of immigrants coming to Europe, thus aiding and abetting the Muslim takeover. So based on our research, I suggest that the addressees of Reza's article are us. We believe in this, and we do need to ask why. So to finalize, I would like to challenge Reza to go beyond the article, from the hermeneutics of the historical text to the interpretation of the present context. And first, how to explain the fact that apparently we did not learn the lessons, and why there is only a handful of articles and scholars sounding an alarm warning that is not being heard. Second, how do we balance the secularly sacred and unassailable right to free speech, with a duty to call out and contradict hate speech? Don't we need to create critical spaces rather than safe spaces in which people are confronting with the flaws of these non-falsifiable falsifications? If all opinions are equally valid, then the only limit to reality is our imagination. Finally, we know that baseless conspiracy theories thrive in environments where noise trumps information and trust succumbs to suspicion. In an era in which scientific validity is qualified or disqualified, as subjective at best or an abstraction at worst, what is the space for science? What is our role? And remembering the late Paulo Freire, isn't participatory action research and critical pedagogy a moral duty as well? I leave it to your reflection. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hugo. You made many interesting points. I think I should perhaps start with the end. What is our role? I don't know. Honestly, that's a tough one. You're absolutely right in pointing out that these ideas are part of the mainstream. The context that I know best, the national context, if you will, that I know best, is France. So I think I'm now fairly familiar with the writings of right-wing polemicists over there. I have reviewed Michel Houellebecq's submission. So I try to sort of like through reviews and interventions in the media, add my 2 pence to the discussion. I'm only starting because this is my first step in this field. Previously, I was mostly concerned with Iranian nationalism. Lots of links, in fact. I don't see myself as someone who's completely converted into a new field, but that's a long story. The reason why most experts of the field do not intervene in the public sphere is quite simple. I mean, I've had chats with a few friends and colleagues, particularly in France, and I am told, essentially to summarize, people do not have the energy and time to spend their time engaging with ruthless ad hominem attacks, armies of millions of trolls attacking them on Twitter and Facebook on a daily basis. And this, unfortunately, leaves the space only for people who would deny that Islamophobia even exists. I mean, that's actually the mainstream, I would say, certainly in France, but I think across the board, the mainstream belief is that there is no such thing as Islamophobia. This is a conspiracy to silence our legitimate criticism of Islam. I have just finished reviewing a book that argues along those lines. It's a French book by a chap called Pascal Bruckner. The title is Imaginary Racism. Yeah, guess what he's talking about. It's absolutely fascinating that his arguments why he believes that Islamophobia does not exist simply do not make sense. First of all, there is this claim that you find across the board in the literature that Islamophobia was coined as a term by the Iranian mullahs in 1979 to repress women who refused to veil themselves. I'm an Iranian historian. I mean, I know the 1979 revolution inside out. I know its ideological text. I know the vocabulary the terminology that they use. They never, ever called anyone an Islamophobe. The claim is a fabrication. It's a fabrication that you find in the literature without any footnote, without any references, without any evidence. But it kind of makes its way. The second claim is that it was used by extremist groups in Britain in the context of Salman Rushdie's the fatwa against his life in the late 80s. And it takes about 10 seconds to Google and find out that Salman Rushdie said 1 year ago that had he written the satanic verses today, he would be called an Islamophobe, which means that back then he was not. And even if that was the case, does the manipulation of a term means that the reality it is referring to is not there, that suddenly it ceases to exist. So one example, there are two examples I come up with in the review of Bruckner, which is that many people on the far left, very easily label anyone who they perceive as too far on the right as a fascist. And sometimes it's simply an attempt to discredit your political adversaries. Fine, it's a manipulation. Does it mean that Mussolini was never born, that the Italian fascist party never existed, never took power? Does it mean that the facts of history just automatically cease to exist? No, I mean, there's a fundamental logical flaw in the argument, and it seems like a majority of the people are not willing to see that. The other example is, of course, anti-Semitism. And the Anti-Defamation League just goes around labeling anyone who criticizes the policies of the State of Israel, particularly the Israeli right, as anti-Semitic. There was an attempt by AIPAC and the Anti-Defamation League last year to pass legislation in the Congress that would criminalize criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic. It foundered. But it's a manipulation of the idea of anti-Semitism. Does it mean that anti-Semitism never existed? That the protocols of the Elders of Zion were never written? That there was not an attempt at exterminating Jews on the European continent? Yes, this flabbergasting logical flaw in the argumentation that you find against Islamophobia. And to me, the question is not whether there is such a thing as Islamophobia. I think it's pretty clear that there is. The main question is, why is there, why do most people find it so hard to admit that there is such a thing? And I think there's essentially, an ideological lens through which at least these authors look at the world. It's very much, inspired by Samuel Huntington and the Clash of Civilizations. On the one hand, you have a very neat, identifiable Western civilization, which is democratic and free and progressive. And on the other hand, you have the Islamic civilization that is regressist, that is oppressive to its women and everybody else. When you have such a rigorous, strict straitjacket, mental straitjacket, you have a very hard time conceptualizing even a Muslim victim or a Muslim that can be a victim of anybody else than other Muslims. And in this case, Westerners. It just simply does not fit into that imagination. So critical culture, yes, you're absolutely right. We should, try to propagate critical culture. I find it very hard these days, personally. And I think maybe I'm more on the pessimist side. I don't think that I will be able to convince anyone. I think that people who believe in conspiracy theories, no amount of logical arguments will ever change their mind. I think there's a cognitive rewiring, perhaps, in the brain that, in fact, convinced them, as Hitler said, every time that liberal newspaper claims that the protocols of the Elders of Zion are a fabrication, the more convinced I become that it is genuine. So it's this sort of mindset that we were talking about. Perhaps colleagues in the project here are better acquainted with the psychological works that have been carried out on conspiracy. I think we have a lot to learn about that. What other? And there is this anti-intellectual strand, which is, of course, becoming more and more powerful in the United States. Here, we saw it in the Brexit debate. In France, of course. So I think we as intellectuals, as scholars, we're having a hard time. We should, of course, keep trying. But I don't know, I'm not very optimistic. You made a very good point. All conspiracy theories are not racist. Absolutely. I mean, I touch on that in the article. A conspiracy theory that features the Illuminati is not a form of racism against the Illuminati. I think the distinction would be that in the cases that I discussed here, there is it's or supplementary racialization. The group has to have already been identified as a race, and the conspiracy is perhaps brings it one step further, as I said, towards identifying that group as our ultimate enemy. Not only different, not only they have inherent characteristics, but they also want to destroy us. I think there is perhaps also something to be said about the fact that a Freemason or an Illuminati are Freemasons and Illuminati by choice. There's a voluntary aspect, whereas you're born a Jew and a Muslim. It's not always a matter of choice. What else? What else? The Pact of Umar is very interesting. I'm not totally familiar with. Perhaps it is a better comparison with the protocols. It also somehow reminds me of the rabbi's speech, which was one of the templates of the protocols of the Elders of Zion. There was also a novel published by a very mediocre author in 1868 called John Radcliffe, and the book was called Biarritz. There is one scene, the book would have sunk into oblivion if it wasn't for one scene. And that scene is a scene in the Prague Jewish Cemetery where there is a gathering of Jewish leaders. And this is the main template of the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And I compare Michel Houellebecq's submission with that novel. There are lots of texts. I mean, it's only now that I'm starting to look at conspiracy theories, both anti-Semitic and Islamophobic, that I realize just the sheer number of them, including about Islamization. As you pointed out, there are lots of different versions of the Islamization theory. You mentioned Renaud Camus' The Great Replacement, yes, hugely popular in French far-right circles. Oriana Fallaci, I mentioned her. There is an author that made a very interesting point recently that Islamization was first formulated by conservative American writers in the early noughties. Unfortunately, I blank on the name of the scholar. As part of an endeavor to show that all things the way the Europeans do it, i.e. multiculturalism and the welfare state, bring about doom, Islamization, etc. And so Islamization was flaunted as where we would go if we did things like the Europeans, as the Democrats would want us to. To summarize. There's just one thing where perhaps it's very minor, might disagree with you on. You mentioned that the Jews were the internal others and the Muslims the external others. I think, in fact, Muslims are the internal others too. There has been a very interesting slippage. So if you go back to the 19th century and this idea of the Semitic race, among Semites you have the internal other, the Jews, and the external other, the Arabs or Muslims whom you encounter in a colonial context, but not at home. There is a slippage that happens whereby after the discovery of Germany's death camps, Jews become part of the self, through this idea of Judeo-Christian civilization, which is, I think, a fairly recent coinage that is very understudied. And Muslims slip from external other to internal other, thus occupying a status that is similar to Jews before. That's just a very minor point.
Reza, shall we move to questions?
Yes, please.
Got a few minutes left.
Okay.
Yeah,
a couple of things. First, I think Dimi status is a real thing in Islamic history. The Pact of Umar is actually part of Islamic jurisprudence. The only disagreement is between, who actually authored it, but it is actually a part, and this is not to say I'm agreeing at all with Batior and how she manipulates it, because for much of Islamic history, many of the stipulations were never actually applied, but this is actually part of Islamic jurisprudence, so that's just a kind of clarification. On the question of the dynamics of Islamophobia versus the dynamics of anti-Semitism, I wonder, when I think about, and I see this also very much, but I see it more in kind of Enlightenment theories of Jews and anti-Judaism before it becomes racialized into anti-Semitism. Questions about whether Jews following Jewish law can ever be part of, can ever be real citizens. What Napoleon does with calling the Sanhedrin before, saying that you were going to be loyal to France before. And when I talk about, I see this more as the kind of the dynamics of how Muslims are treated versus trying to talk about it once you actually get a kind of blood racial, biological view. And I understand you were trying to say that these things are much more complicated and they're more cultural, but I saw the connections more kind of from the Enlightenment view of Jews.
Yes, no, the Enlightenment looms large in all these debates. I mean, I'm reminded of an author called Matti Bunzl, who was one of the first to broach this discussion on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And he makes a very interesting point whereby he says that Jews fell victim to anti-Semitism at the time where there was an attempt in the context of emancipation to exclude them from the nation state or claim that they could possibly not become part of our nation state, Germany mainly, but also elsewhere, France, etc. Whereas most Islamophobic literature today takes is in a bigger context of Europeanness, that Muslims everywhere in Europe essentially are alien to European and Western civilization because they did not experience modernity in the way we experienced it. They did not have an enlightenment, they did not have reformation, etc. So it's very interesting that the exclusion, there are similar dynamics and mechanisms in the way exclusion is implemented discursively. However, in one case, it is fundamentally in the context of the nation state, whereas in the other, it's a broader context of, them coming over to Europe from outside of Europe. And we found that obviously in 2015, summer of 2015, all these discussions about refugees from Syria at the gates. And
Don't you think the main reason why, if you talk to people and you try to make this case, the kind of the elephant in the room is terrorism. That's the.
Oh, absolutely.
That's why people don't want to make, no, Jews were never terrorists.
Yes.
Jews were, this is basically.
Yes. Jews were perceived as anarchists and Bolsheviks, etc., but there were no Jews going around throwing bombs in the name of Judaism. No doubt about that. And I think this is a major difference, a historical difference between the context of anti-Semitism in the interwar period and Islamophobia today. And there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that jihadists significantly contribute to Islamophobia. Well, I mean, most of the stuff we study is post-2001. There's a reason for that. What I found more fascinating is how Islamophobes and jihadists agree on most things. They agree. Geert Wilders and Baghdadi agree that there is only one Islam and that it's fundamentally political and that it should target Westerners. There are actually something very interesting to be said there, but no doubt that jihadism is in the background of all of this. That being said, a lot of the discursive mechanisms used in Islamophobia were there long before the current outbreak of international terrorism. And you find 19th century texts that refer to fanaticism and Orientalist texts, violence before. But they were sort of like deployed and developed, and they morphed into something new in a context of jihadism. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I've been thinking about a lot of these kind of relationships between racism and conspiracy theory in the course of the project. And I would just kind of take issue with the way that you've framed it with regard to the protocols. And it's kind of getting back to what Hugo was saying. Because I think that your comparison with Eurabia and Islamization has led you to project onto that text a racial element which actually is not there. Because when I look at it, the comparison, I come at it from a different comparison of namely anti-Jesuit literature and anti-Jewish literature. And so if you see it through that lens, of course, you're not kind of picking up on the racial element, but I still would say, therefore, that it's not there in that text. The story that has got to be told, and you've put your finger really on a crucial issue which has been totally neglected, but in the reception of the protocols, and even in the cover which you just showed, and of course there are hundreds of these covers, there you see, of course, the caricature of the Jew who's controlling the world with the exaggerated features, and that is clearly kind of a case of racialization which is occurring there. But it's not in the text itself. The text itself draws upon different traditions, but none of those traditions have anything to do with discourses about race, and it's only subsequently, because I mean the thing about the protocols is there's the text itself which hardly anyone ever reads, and then there's the reception of the text. And the racialization is occurring when it comes to the reception of the text, and it's not in the text itself. So that would be just simply my kind of like my point there when it comes to the way people frame.
No, you have a point. I think we can partly agree to disagree. I think you are right in pointing out that the protocols, the text itself, does not put forth a definition of what the Jews are, whereas Batior does that, mainly because of the format of her work. So she does actually go to length to define what this Islamic essence is. The protocols don't do that. It's simply a narrative of that meeting and of the conspiracy itself. However, that being said, I think it's undeniable that the protocols as a conspiracy theory graft themselves on a tradition of anti-Semitism, of racial anti-Semitism as it existed then, that it could not come about without the idea of the Jew as a different race. And my point about conspiratorial racialization is that there is a population that is assumed to have inherent characteristics. And in the case of the protocols, it is the conspiracy itself. And you have as many definitions of race as you have scholars of race and racism. My definition of race in my work is a population which is assumed to share inherent behavioral and psychological characteristics. Now, it can be on grounds of religion, on grounds of culture, on grounds of biological racism. But I think it certainly grafts itself on an existing, if you will, definition of the Jew and the Jews as conspiring against us.
Okay, I'm afraid we actually need to finish there, but there'll be a chance to continue the conversation outside with some wine. So thank you
I'd be very
much
pleased
for that
to continue.
very interesting talk.
Thank you.